Today, in this episode, we will dive into the scariest polar bear attacks, from a well-aware photographer that was in the proximity of an aggressive polar bear to a woman who got too close to one trying to get famous. But first, let's start with an Instagram model who got fatally mauled by a starving polar bear. The morning of November 14th, 2016 arrived over the Svalbard archipelago without a sunrise. The polar night had settled in weeks earlier, and what passed for daylight was nothing more than a brief gray suggestion on the horizon before the darkness swallowed it again. Lara Neumann had not come here for the silence. At 24, the Berlin-born Instagram model had spent 3 years building a following through travel content. By late 2016, the numbers were slipping. The algorithm was punishing to repetition, and Lara understood that beaches and city rooftops were no longer enough. She needed something raw, something that looked genuinely dangerous. That search brought her to Svalbard, and she arrived with her camera equipment, her eye for composition, and absolutely no wilderness training. Svalbard operates under laws that exist for a single reason: polar bears. The archipelago is home to roughly 3,000 of them. Firearms were mandatory outside the settlement perimeter. Flare guns were to be carried at all times as a first-line deterrent. Tripwire alarm systems were set around camp each night, and the rule above all rules: no one leaves camp alone, not for any reason. The other members of the group absorbed the briefings with the seriousness deserved. Lara listened, nodded, and privately began calculating how much better her content would be without a group of people in matching orange jackets around her. Those who traveled with her described her as pleasant but distracted, always mentally framing the next shot. The evening before the incident, she had quietly scouted a ridge just beyond the camp's safe perimeter, noting that the light at dawn would be extraordinary from that position. She told no one. The camp was still dark when Lara dressed and moved quietly toward the ridge. She carried her camera. She had deliberately left her flare gun on her bunk. She did not carry a firearm. She left no note. Investigators later determined that the tripwire alarm had been correctly deployed along the eastern perimeter, but they could not establish with certainty exactly how Lara passed through it without triggering an alert. Based on footprints recovered in the snow, the most likely explanation was that she moved through a section where the line ran close to a natural depression in the ground, a gap in coverage the guides had not identified in the dark. Whether she knew the gap was there or simply got lucky, no one could say. What Lara could not have known was that a polar bear had been moving through the area since before dawn. Polar bears are active hunters who move through Arctic darkness with a silence and efficiency that makes them almost impossible to detect until the moment of contact. A fully grown adult can weigh over 700 kilograms and reach speeds of 40 kilometers per hour across open snow. When food has been scarce, as it had been that season, with sea ice forming later each year, a polar bear's hunger transforms it into something operating on pure biological urgency. It does not issue warnings. When it identifies a food source at close range, it moves. The bear was large, visibly malnourished, and working its way along the ridgeline when it detected Lara. The encounter happened at close range, in the dark, in the silence she had come so far to find. The camp's morning watch noticed her empty bunk and untouched flare gun approximately 40 minutes after she had left. By the time the guides reached the ridge, following her tracks in the snow, the situation was already beyond recovery. Lara was alive when the first guide reached her, but her injuries were severe. A helicopter evacuation was requested immediately, but weather conditions over the archipelago that morning complicated the response. She died before the evacuation could be completed. Investigators could not determine with certainty whether the bear had been tracking her or encountered her. Suddenly, the wind and darkness made the sequence difficult to reconstruct. What they could determine was that Lara had been alone, unarmed, without her flare gun, outside the perimeter in the Arctic dark, and that a malnourished polar bear had been in the same area at the same time. The guides were cleared of any negligence. The failure was entirely Lara's, rooted not in ignorance, but in a conscious decision to prioritize a photograph over rules that existed to keep her alive. She was 24 years old and had been in the Arctic for less than a week. But while Lara's story ended in the Arctic dark, another would unfold just 2 years earlier under the gray skies of the Barents Sea coast, where a man who knew more about polar bears than almost anyone alive would discover that experience, without the right equipment in your hands at the right moment, is just confidence with nowhere left to go. The morning of March 3rd, 2014, broke over the Barents Sea coast with the kind of light that Norwegian photographers spend their careers chasing: low, flat, and silver, filtering across the sea ice in long horizontal bands that made the landscape look painted rather than real. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up enough to reduce visibility across the open tundra and blur the line between sky and ice. It was the kind of deteriorating Arctic weather that experienced field workers recognize immediately as a signal to pull back. Jonas Eide recognized it too. He just didn't stop. At 38, The Tromsø-born wildlife photographer was one of the most respected professionals working in the Norwegian Arctic. His work had appeared in major nature publications across Europe and Scandinavia. He was not a tourist with a camera. He was a professional whose career had been built on getting close to animals that most people would never willingly approach. He had developed a philosophy around what he called controlled risk, the idea that with enough knowledge and experience, you could calculate exactly how close was too close and stop just before that line. His colleagues described him with a mixture of admiration and unease. Brilliant behind a lens, they said, but he always pushed, and he had always walked away. That record of survival had become, without him fully realizing it, the most dangerous thing about him. That morning, Jonas and his assistant Eric had been tracking a polar bear moving along the coast, a visibly malnourished adult, its frame gaunt beneath yellowed fur, moving with the focused energy of an animal that had not eaten properly in days. Both men carried signal pistols, flare guns capable of deterring a bear at range, and their rifle was secured on the snowmobile roughly 300 meters back. Standard field practice, enough deterrent for most situations, under most conditions. At some point during their approach, the worsening wind had pushed them further from the snowmobile than either man had fully registered. The bear was close, the light was still workable, and Jonas made the decision to continue on foot. He still had the signal pistol. He believed, with the full weight of his experience, that he understood what this animal would do next. What Jonas had perhaps allowed himself to forget is that a malnourished polar bear is a fundamentally different animal from a well-fed one. A bear that has not eaten in days does not observe from a distance and decide. It detects, assesses in seconds, and moves. And in deteriorating visibility, with wind carrying scent unpredictably, the distance Jonas had calculated as safe was not the distance the bear was working with. The bear detected him faster than expected. It paused briefly, perhaps 30 seconds, then began closing the distance with a directness that left little ambiguity. Jonas raised the signal pistol and fired. The flare discharged into the wind and detonated well off to the left of the bear. The animal flinched and slowed. For a moment, it seemed like it might turn. Eric, positioned roughly 50 meters behind, began shouting and waving his arms. The bear registered him briefly, then refocused on Jonas. The hesitation lasted only seconds. Jonas had no second flare loaded in time. The attack, when it came, was fast and overwhelming. Whether it was predatory or defensive, investigators later said they could not determine with certainty. The physical evidence was consistent with both. Eric ran toward them, still shouting, and the commotion was enough to cause the bear to disengage and move off into the deteriorating visibility. Eric reached Jonas within minutes and radioed for emergency assistance. Jonas was conscious when Eric reached him, but his injuries were severe, the kind that the open tundra, 300 meters from a snowmobile and hours from a hospital, is not equipped to manage. He died before the rescue team arrived. The investigation confirmed what those who knew Jonas had quietly feared, that his system of controlled risk had always depended on variables he could not fully control. The weather had compromised his visibility and the effectiveness of his flare. The distance from the snowmobile had removed his most reliable deterrent, and the bear, driven by hunger that overrode the partial warning the flare had provided, had not behaved the way Jonas's experience told him it would. His death sparked a difficult conversation in the wildlife photography community about the culture of proximity, the pressure to get closer in pursuit of the defining image, and the way repeated success in dangerous situations can silently erode the instincts that keep people alive. Jonas Eide was not reckless. He was experienced, skilled, and deeply knowledgeable. He had a deterrent in his hand and he used it, and none of it was enough. But the lesson Jonas left behind would travel far beyond Norway, all the way to the research stations of Baffin Island, where a young woman was about to discover that even the smallest deviation from protocol, just a few minutes alone, just a short distance from her partner, can bring you face to face with something that no amount of good intentions can stop. The morning of August 22, 2017 arrived over Baffin Island with the kind of clarity that only exists at the top of the world. The temperature sat at 4 degrees Celsius, and the tundra was doing what it only does for a few weeks each year, blooming. Claire Donovan had been on the island for 11 days, and she was starting to feel the pull of that openness. At 31, the Vancouver-based environmental blogger had built a loyal following around her ability to put readers inside the places she visited, not just the landscapes, but the emotional texture of them. She wrote with genuine feeling about the natural world, and that belief had brought her to Baffin Island as part of a climate research team. Her role was to document the human dimension of their work. It was the most significant assignment of her career. The research team operated under strict field protocols. Always travel in pairs, always carry bear spray and a flare, always report your route before leaving camp. Claire followed them precisely for the first several days, but she began to feel the tension between the protocols and the story she was trying to tell. The paired movement requirement meant she was rarely alone with a subject, and the footage felt crowded and self-conscious. She began making small adjustments, brief moments of separation, a few extra minutes away from her partner to capture a particular angle. Her assigned partner Tom noticed but said nothing. On the morning of August 22nd, moving along a section of tundra roughly 2 kilometers from camp, Claire spotted a set of tracks in the soft ground near a rocky ridge. She told Tom she would catch up in a few minutes and moved toward the ridge alone. She had her bear spray clipped to her hip. The tracks were large and deeply pressed, the kind of impression that comes from significant weight moving at a deliberate pace. She estimated they were several hours old based on the slight weathering at the edges. She was wrong. What the tracks alone could not tell her is that polar bears are among the most energy-efficient large predators on Earth. When food is scarce, they find a sheltered position, lower their metabolic rate, and rest for hours, leaving almost no trace of their presence. They do not move, do not vocalize, do not betray themselves in any way until something enters their immediate space. And when that happens, the response is not gradual. A polar bear can go from completely motionless to a full charge in under a second, with forepaws capable of delivering a blow with the force of a small vehicle. The tracks were fresh. The bear had settled on the far side of the ridge to rest. When Claire crested it, the bear was less than 12 meters away. She reached for the bear spray on instinct and discharged it, but at that distance, in a light crosswind, whether the spray deployed fully before the bear made contact could not be determined from the evidence recovered afterward. Her camera was found on the ground near the top of the ridge, its lens cracked, damaged in a way consistent with being dropped or struck. Tom realized something was wrong when Claire failed to reappear after 10 minutes. He found the camera and radioed camp immediately. The response team reached the site as quickly as the terrain allowed. The ground was uneven, and a low fog had settled into the valley that morning, adding several minutes to the response. Claire was alive when they arrived, but her injuries were critical. She was airlifted from the island, but did not survive the journey. The team leader wrote in his incident report that the margin between safety and catastrophe in polar bear territory is not measured in hours or even minutes. It is measured in the seconds it takes an animal to cover 12 meters. Claire had done almost everything right. The pale blue sky over Baffin Island remained unchanged, indifferent to what had happened beneath it. But the lesson it delivered that morning would travel south and west, all the way to Churchill, Manitoba, where a filmmaker was about to discover that the most dangerous word in polar bear country is not closer. It is just a few seconds, just outside the vehicle, just this once. The night of January 9th, 2013 had settled over Churchill, Manitoba, with the kind of cold that makes the air feel solid. The temperature had dropped to minus 27 degrees Celsius, and the wind coming off Hudson Bay was pushing the wind chill past minus 40 in the open ground, beyond the town's edge. Miguel Alvarez had been in Churchill for 6 days, and he was running out of patience with the Tundra vehicle. At 45, the Los Angeles-based independent documentary filmmaker had spent 15 years building a career on doing more with less. The documentary he was developing in Churchill focused on the relationship between the town's residents and the polar bears that moved through their community each winter. He had arrived with a small crew of 3, minimal equipment, and no dedicated wildlife safety personnel. The budget didn't allow for it. Local guides had been clear from the first day. In high-risk zones, particularly at night and near areas known to attract bears, the Tundra vehicle was not optional. It was the boundary between safe and unsafe. Miguel had complied for the first several days, but the vehicle was getting in the way of the film. The windows created reflections. The angles were limited. He began to think of it as an obstacle rather than a protection, and that shift in thinking, quiet, gradual, entirely internal, was the most dangerous thing that happened to Miguel Alvarez in Churchill. Churchill bears are not the same as wilderness bears. Years of proximity to human settlements have conditioned them to associate human spaces with food, making them bolder and more difficult to read. They approach, they investigate, they push boundaries in ways that can look, to an untrained eye, like tolerance. Churchill's bear management program dealt with this reality. Every season problem bears were captured and relocated or held temporarily in a facility locals called the Polar Bear Jail until the bay ice formed and they could be released safely. On the night of January 9th, the crew had positioned their vehicle near a garbage containment area on the outskirts of town, a location known to attract bears because of residual scent. They had been waiting over an hour when Miguel spotted a large bear nosing along the perimeter fence with the unhurried confidence of an animal that had done this many times before. The shot through the vehicle window was compromised. The angle was wrong, the glass was fogging, and the bear was positioned in a way that would have been extraordinary from ground level. 30 seconds, maybe less, to step out, reposition, capture the shot, and return. He told his crew he would be right back. He opened the door and stepped onto the frozen ground. The bear registered him immediately. It lifted its head, oriented toward him, and paused the brief assessing stillness that Churchill guides recognize as the moment before a decision is made. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the bear began closing the distance, not charging, but advancing with a slow, deliberate purpose that left no room for misinterpretation. Inside the vehicle, the crew reacted. One leaned on the horn, another hit the headlights, a third cracked the window and shouted. The bear slowed, turned its head toward the vehicle, then turned back to Miguel. The noise and light had registered. They had not been enough. The advance became a charge, fast and direct, covering the distance before Miguel could retreat. Miguel sustained severe injuries. The bear disengaged when the crew rushed out of the vehicle, the sudden movement breaking its focus long enough to pull Miguel back inside. He was conscious and speaking when they called emergency services. He was airlifted to a Winnipeg hospital, where he died from his injuries 2 days later. The bear was identified by Manitoba conservation officers as a known individual that had been relocated from the Churchill area once before, after approaching vehicles on multiple occasions. Following the incident, it was captured and removed from the population permanently. The investigation was unambiguous. Miguel had exited a protected vehicle in a designated high-risk zone at night, without a deterrent, in an area with confirmed recent bear activity. The decision to step outside had been his alone, made in the belief that 30 seconds was not enough time for something to go wrong. But the cold of the Canadian Arctic was not the only place where overconfidence was writing its own ending. Far to the east, on a remote island in the Russian Arctic, a young woman was about to discover that the most dangerous thing about a wild animal is not the first encounter, it is the 10th, because by the 10th, you have stopped being afraid, and in polar bear territory, fear is not a weakness, it is the only thing keeping you alive. The morning of December 2nd, 2018 did not exist on Novaya Zemlya, not in any meaningful sense. The polar night had settled over the remote Russian archipelago weeks earlier, and what greeted the island each day was not dawn, but simply a slightly different quality of darkness, the deep black of midnight, giving way to a cold blue-gray nothing before collapsing back into black again by early afternoon. And moving through that darkness, pressing against windows, pushing through unsecured doors, were the bears, dozens of them, driven in from the sea ice by food scarcity and the faint warmth of human habitation. Anya Sokolova had arrived 3 weeks earlier with a camera, a backpack, and the unshakable conviction that this was exactly the kind of story her audience needed to see. At 27, the St. Petersburg-born travel vlogger had built her following on the premise of radical authenticity. Where other creators curated aspirational content, Anya went to the places that were genuinely difficult and brought her audience with her in real time. She had a natural on-camera presence, a dry wit that translated well across languages, and an instinct for finding the human story inside the extreme location. She was also, by late 2018, deeply aware of what her audience responded to most. The bear content from her first days on the island had performed better than anything she had uploaded in months. The comments were full of people asking for more, asking her to get closer. The locals had warned her from the beginning: never approach, never run, always maintain distance. For the first several days, Anya respected those boundaries. She filmed from safe distances and let the story come to her. But the engagement numbers were pulling in the opposite direction, and Anya was listening to them. Each video featuring closer bear footage performed better than the one before. She began reading the bear's behavior through the lens of that feedback, rather than through the lens of the warnings she had received. Over the course of several days, the distance from which she filmed decreased, not dramatically, not in any single moment that felt reckless, but steadily, one cautious step at a time. Officials who later reviewed her footage noted that several earlier close-range encounters had ended without escalation, but they were careful to add that such outcomes were inconsistent and not predictive of future behavior. The fact that previous approaches had not triggered an attack did not mean the behavior was safe. It meant the variables had not yet aligned in the wrong way. What Anya had not accounted for is that a polar bear's visible behavior is not a reliable window into its internal state. A polar bear under significant pressure can absorb that stress internally, continuing to move in ways that look, from a distance, like relative calm, right up until the threshold is crossed. And that threshold is not fixed. It shifts with hunger, with stress, with the cumulative pressure of weeks spent in an environment not providing enough food. What looked like tolerance on day 18 may not be tolerance on day 22. On December 2nd, Anya located a bear near the edge of the settlement, a thin adult she had filmed before from a greater distance. She began her approach while narrating, her camera steady, her voice calm. At around 30 meters, something in the bear's posture shifted subtle enough that she did not immediately stop, but enough that her narration faltered briefly. She slowed. In the footage recovered afterward, there is a moment where her voice drops slightly and her movement pauses. Then she continued forward, interpreting what she had seen as the bear simply adjusting its position. It was a reasonable interpretation. It was also wrong. The bear had already begun closing the distance before she registered it as a charge. It had not exploded from a standstill, it had been drifting toward her in that low-weighted way that precedes an attack. And by the time the movement resolved into something she recognized as dangerous, the gap had collapsed to almost nothing. She had no time to deploy a deterrent. She had no time to back away. Residents nearby heard the commotion and alerted emergency services. Anya was reached within minutes, but the injuries she sustained were catastrophic, and the medical resources on the island were not equipped to manage them. She died before she could be evacuated to the mainland. Russian authorities recovered her camera equipment in the aftermath. The footage was later used with significant editing and public safety campaigns, distributed to journalists and content creators working in Arctic regions. She was 27 years old. She had been on Novaya Zemlya for 22 days. In the recovered footage, there is a moment, brief, quiet, easy to miss, where her narration stops and she slows her approach. She had noticed something. She just couldn't tell at that moment what it meant. Footage was never uploaded to the media due to high graphic content. The investigation found no failures of infrastructure, no negligence by local authorities, no systemic breakdown. The warnings had been given. The protocols had existed. The only thing that had failed was the human capacity to maintain fear in the face of repeated safety, to keep treating a dangerous thing as dangerous after it has failed to hurt you enough times in a row.